originally scheduled for May the 6th. I think we all know what we weren't doing on May the 6th, 2020. But we are thrilled. We are thrilled to have Shon Hopwood here with us today. And he has the greatest bio I have ever seen a speaker give. It is 2 sentences. So he is not going to let me steal any of his thunder. Shon Hopwood is a lawyer and an associate professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. He is an advocate for criminal justice reform, and his story has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, and on 60 Minutes. With that, I give you Shon Hopwood.
Thank you. Well, as someone who speaks at lots of lawyer events, oftentimes the introductions take up a lot of time. So I like to just move things along. Thank you to the YPO for having me. Thank you for having an in-person speaking event. It's my first since March. Needless to say, most of the things I do these days are on Zoom. And I am tired of seeing just faces on Zoom. So it's nice to be able to actually see some people. I'm going to start my story in January 2018, which for me felt like another one of those times where I just felt like someone pinched me. Am I actually living in a dream? I was in the Roosevelt room of the White House, and I was about to be introduced to the President of the United States. And I have lots of introductions I give, but I've gotten one that I like to give to everyone. I've given it at Rotary clubs. I've given it at elementary schools. I've given it to law schools, universities, corporations, and it goes something like this. My name is Shon Hopwood. I'm an associate professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, and I committed a violent crime, but I am not a violent criminal. And the reason I start that out with my story is because I want people to remember that no matter what you've done, what you have done, what you've been caught for, what you got away with, people change. And the law should recognize that. And so my story starts in 1998 as I'm standing before a judge named Richard G. Tuck, and I'm about to be sentenced for my role in 5 armed bank robberies. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but they were serious crimes that I committed as a young, reckless, and foolish young man. And I was sentenced to 12 years and 3 months in federal prison. And I went to prison. And the first thing I realized about prison was I did not like it. And what I saw was, like a place where every day the message implicitly and explicitly was, you're a piece of garbage, you're never going to amount to anything, and it's only a matter of time before you get out and do the same thing again. And what I also saw was a lot of failure of the system, a lot of people that would come into the prison system and go out for a little bit, and then commit a new offense and come back in. We actually had a name for that. It's both funny and sad at the same time. We called it doing life on the installment plan. And the one thing I wanted to do was not do that. But I didn't know what I was going to do because I was a young, foolish, reckless 21-year-old who really didn't have any desire or any purpose in my life. I was fortunate to get a job in the prison law library. And, I, at that point in my life, had not taken freshman English. I wanted nothing to do with the law. The first 6 months I worked in that law library, all I did was check out books. Those law books, when I would pull one off the shelf, they were big, they were thick, they were intimidating. And when I did actually open one up and try to read it, it felt like it was written in another language. And so I wanted nothing to do with the law, right up until the point of June 26th of 2000, when the Supreme Court of the United States handed down a decision called Penn v. New Jersey that I, along with every other person in federal prison, had hoped would apply to the federal sentencing guidelines because that might mean I would get a sentence reduction. There is no bigger incentive for someone in prison than the thought of getting out early. And so I studied the law for 2 months. And I pecked out a brief on a prison typewriter, and I sent it off to the court. And I was so excited. I'm going to challenge my own sentence. I'm going to get a sentence reduction. I'm going to get to go home early. And then I got a letter back from the court 3 weeks later that said, Mr. Hopwood, really behoove you to file your brief in the correct court. So that was the beginning of my legal career. Filing a brief in the wrong court, and a legal brief that I had pecked out on a prison typewriter. Fortunately, I got a little better after that. I decided that I kind of enjoyed this process of solving this legal puzzle and writing out the solution. And so I started writing legal briefs for friends of mine who either had lawyers or did not have lawyers. And the second legal brief I ever prepared in my life was for a man named John Fellows, who had just been denied appeal, and whose lawyer had said, well, you know, John, you have no chance of getting your case heard by the Supreme Court. And the lawyer wasn't wrong. The Supreme Court of the United States gets around 7,000 to 8,000 petitions a year. It grants around 70 to 80 cases, meaning you have a 1% chance of having your case heard by the court. That 1% chance is for the lawyers filing a case to the Supreme Court, not innocent federal prisoners, where on the front page of the brief or the lawyer's name, it just said John Fellows pro se, meaning he was representing himself. To get a case like that heard by the Supreme Court is about 1% of 1%. Happens maybe every 10, 20 years. And so when John asked me to prepare this petition to the Supreme Court, I quickly said no. He convinced me to do it, and I spent 2 months working on it, and I prepared his legal brief on a prison typewriter, and we sent it off to the court. And then John transferred to another prison, and I largely forgot about John and his case. Until one morning, I was headed to the recreation yard to go work out. I used to work out at 6:30 in the morning every day. I was headed out to the recreation yard, and a friend of mine came running and screaming my name. Shon, Shon, Shon. I was in a medium-high federal prison. My first thought was, what did I say to my buddy yesterday that he wants to come fight me at 6:30 in the morning? If you see two people running and screaming at each other in federal prison, it is not a good sign. But you don't go to a fight with a newspaper in your hand. And what my friend had was a copy of the USA Today, and he opened it up and said, can you believe this? And I read it, and it said, the Supreme Court of the United States had granted John Fellows' petition. It said how unlikely that was, given he had filed without a lawyer, and it even quoted a couple of those sentences that I had pecked out on that prison typewriter. Now, I knew this was a big deal, but you would have never convinced me in that moment that this one little thing would lead to eventually going to law school and becoming a lawyer or a law professor. I would have never guessed that. But I'll tell you one thing, it changed almost immediately. I became very, very popular in federal prison. There weren't many days I could walk across the compound without someone saying, hey, Shon, you got 5 minutes? Just let me tell you about my case. And if you saw my mailbox at Georgetown Law School, in some ways things haven't changed. My mailbox, this law school has to keep expanding outward because I get lots of mail from people in prison, and I get lots of mail, particularly lots of mail from mothers who have sons and daughters in the prison system and who are looking for some help. And so, you know, that began my legal career. I was fortunate, and John Fellows was fortunate, that the lawyer who decided to take the case came on. His name's Seth Waxman. He's the former Solicitor General of the United States during the Clinton administration. The Solicitor General is the person who represents the United States government in every case before the Supreme Court. Generally, if a lawyer gets to argue 5 times in the Supreme Court in their lifetime, they're considered an expert. Seth Waxman, I think, has argued 89 cases in the Supreme Court of the United States. Seth Waxman did not need my help, but Seth Waxman told John Fellows, the only way I will take this case is if you introduce me to this guy that wrote this petition that got the case granted. I want him to be involved with the team. And what I can tell you is federal prison is used to having lawyers call to contact their clients. What we're not used to is lawyers calling to contact their jailhouse lawyers to talk about the case. And so, you know, that caused a little bit of disruption, but we managed through it. And Seth and Noah Levine from this large law firm, Wilmer Hale, made me a part of the team. I can't tell you how much that impacted how I thought of myself. Because again, that message every day, implicitly and explicitly, I was getting was bad. And to have someone like a Seth Waxman say, not only did you do a good job, but I would have been proud to write this cert petition. Well, it made a huge difference in my life. And so so I worked with the lawyers. They would send in drafts of the marriage briefs, and I would write sticky notes and send them back out. Wilmer Hale had a nickname for me. I was in-house counsel, as in the big house. Eventually, Seth Waxman argued that case. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court does not let people in federal prison come to the Supreme Court in handcuffs and shackles and stand up at the lectern and argue it. Seth argued the case, and we won that case 9-0. A year later, I got the Supreme Court to grant another case I had prepared for another prisoner. Then I won a case in the Sixth Circuit. And then I started running cases in federal district courts kind of across the country. Even though I had not taken freshman English in college and had not finished a bachelor's degree, let alone gone to law school. And when I say I didn't know anything about the law, I really mean it. I could not have named a right in the Bill of Rights. And when I got in trouble, that was my first time really experiencing criminal law and anything like that. So I knew nothing when I began this process. Well, what I realized was through a case that I helped for a man named Melvin Brown. I worked on a case for an African-American man named Melvin Brown who received a 16-year sentence for a handful of crack cocaine. And what had happened was his lawyer had made some mistakes, and that had cost Melvin 10 more years in federal prison. Melvin asked me to take his case, and we won his case, and he was resentenced. And when Melvin came back to the prison, I was walking to the chow hall, and he came running and screaming again at me, which is, again, not the norm for federal prison, and gave me a huge hug in the compound. White man or black man giving each other a hug in federal prison is not an everyday occurrence. That, again, changed my life. And what I found was that I really enjoyed using my skills to help other people. And so this launched my career. And in 2008, I was released. At that time, I was representing, 10 to 15 people at once in federal prison. But I was finally released to a halfway house in 2008. Anybody remember what the economy was like in 2008? It's hard to find work for anyone, let alone the guy that robbed banks who just got out of federal prison. I went to job interview after job interview, rejection after rejection. I always remember one of them. I went and interviewed to be a used car salesman. And the owner looks at my resume and he says, "You've got like a 10-year resume gap here." Resume gap was the alternative title to my memoir. Random House turned it down, but I thought it would have been a good title for my book. He said, "You have a 10-year resume gap." And I said, "Yes, let me explain that." And I no sooner got the word prison out of my mouth, and he said, "Shon, can we talk about this outside?" So we walked through the showroom past people that were looking to buy cars, and we get just outside the door. And he says, "Mr. Hopwood, please don't ever come back here again." And what I realized is the ethical bar for used car dealers is not high. I might have a problem finding a job anyway. And so my first job was telemarketing. I had to make phone calls to people in Oregon at around dinner time. I had been in prison for 10 years. I kind of still spoke like someone in prison. And when I would call these people and they would scream at me, I would scream back. That job lasted one day. My second job was washing cars at a used car dealership. But this again is Omaha, Nebraska, and they wanted me to wash cars outside, and that was October. And I realized by end of November, December, it's going to freeze, I'm going to be out of a job. And so I found this job at this place that was just, it felt like it was magically made for me to apply to. What I had found is, even though I had a lot of skills in the law, very few law firms were willing to hire me. Very few people were willing to take a second chance. And what I found was knowledge of the U.S. Supreme Court is not a necessary job skill in Omaha, Nebraska, even at the law firms, because most of them don't take cases that long. Then I found a job that said, "We are looking for a document analyst, or someone who knows about the Supreme Court," and this office just happened to be in Omaha, Nebraska. It's one of the 5 brief printers for the Supreme Court, meaning they get cases from all over the country from lawyers, and they help lawyers file their briefs and their cases in the Supreme Court of the United States, even though they happen to be located in downtown Omaha, Nebraska. So I applied for this job, and there was a problem. I told them I had a reference letter from Seth Waxman and that I had gotten 2 cases granted by the Supreme Court, but I was not a lawyer. And the first thing they asked for was, can you send us a PDF of that reference letter from Seth Waxman? We'd really like to see that. When I got out, I had never been on the internet. I'd never seen an iPhone, an iPad, an iPod. The things I do now, with a few clicks on my phone, I was completely unaware of. I was never able to send Cockle a PDF copy of that reference letter because I didn't know what a PDF was. And neither did anybody else in the halfway house. And so I ended up going to this interview, and the Cockles later told me, as they said on 60 Minutes, they had actually filled the job before they interviewed me. You know why they were interviewing me? Because Andy Cockle thought I was delusional, and he, in his words, said, we thought Shon was a crackpot. They were really just interviewing me to find out how someone could have gotten 2 cases granted by the Supreme Court without being a lawyer. And they thought there might be an unusual story behind that. And boy, were they right. I just remember when they asked, how did you do this? Taking one deep breath and one long run-on sentence about how I learned how to be a lawyer in prison. I'm not a lawyer, but I served time for 10 years for bank robberies I committed in my early 20s, and please give me a second chance. And when I got done, they looked like this. And to me, it felt like their mouths hung open for hours. But the Cockles gave me my big break. They ended up giving me a job. And one of the reasons why they gave me a job was they called Seth Waxman's office. They had been trying to get his work for quite some time. But he has lots of associates and receptionists that answer his phone. And so they were shocked when they left a message that said, hey, Mr. Waxman, we don't want to talk about getting your business. We want to talk to you about Shon Hopwood. When Seth Waxman called back 5 minutes later and said, you should really hire Shon. He will be an asset to your team. They were even more shocked when they called Noah Levine. And what Noah Levine said was, I have talked with Shon every month for the last 6 years while he's been in prison. And I live in New York, and what I can tell you is if Shon comes to New York, he will not stay at a hotel. He will stay at my house with my wife and kids. That's how much I trust Shon. And that is basically my story in a nutshell in so many ways. People tend to view me as a pull yourself up by the bootstrap story. But I could have been the hardest working, smartest lawyer on the planet, neither of which is true, by the way. But even if that were true, that would not have given me the opportunities I've been given. My story is that people who had nothing in it for them went out of their way to give me second chances. And so that's what happened. I get a job at Cockle Legal Briefs, and I work with a law professor from the University of Michigan on a case, and he tells my story to Adam Liptak at the New York Times, who writes a story in February of 2010, and let's just say my life has never been the same since. The Cockles happened to get that day more hits on their website the day this New York Times article was published than they had in the 3 years prior combined. And it turned out to be a great deal for their business. And for me, you know, it led to a book deal, and it led to people actually thinking about letting me go to law school. And I applied to law school after I finished my bachelor's degree, and the University of Washington said yes. Not only did they say yes, but one of the things I was worried about with law school was I had a wife and a baby boy and another baby on the way, and it's not that I was broke. I was actually in the hole because I still owed $170,000 in restitution for the money I took. And I felt morally obligated to pay that back. And so I was worried about how we would pay for law school. And I applied for it and landed a public service scholarship at the University of Washington that paid for all of my law school and my living expenses. And we moved out to Seattle, and I went to law school at the age of 33 as someone with multiple felonies on their background. And I absolutely loved law school. And when I was finishing law school, people said, well, what type of job would you like to do after law school? I said, well, I think I'd like to work for a federal judge. Needless to say, most people at the law school kind of chuckled at that and said, well, Shon, maybe you have to be a little more realistic. There may be a few judges that are a little concerned about hiring you given your background. As with lots of things in life, I didn't listen to people, and I was pretty persistent about trying to get my second chance in life. I had been told by countless numbers of lawyers, Shon, no law school is ever going to admit you. Even if they do, no bar association is ever going to say you have the character and fitness necessary to practice law. And so I have been told many, many times that you can't do this and you can't do that. But as I like to tell people in prison, you have to be stubborn for your success in order to get it. And you can't just let the people, the naysayers, convince you that you can't do something. And so I did, and I applied, and I ended up getting a clerkship with a federal judge on the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, which is widely considered to be the second most important court in the country. And Judge Janice Rogers Brown, when I think few federal judges would have given me a second chance, did, and she hired me. As I was being hired for that clerkship, I was trying to convince the Washington State Bar Association to give me a law license. Needless to say, it was a long process, but they said we were going to make a favorable recommendation to the Washington Supreme Court. And one morning, as my wife was driving me to the metro in Washington, D.C., so that I could go on to the courthouse to work for Judge Brown, I got an unpublished opinion, one-page order from the Washington State Supreme Court saying you have the character and fitness necessary to practice law. If you pass the bar exam, we're going to let you in the lawyer club. And boy, was that a relief. Later on, and this is one of my favorite stories to tell, I helped a woman who was in similar circumstances to me. When I was in law school, this woman, whose name is Tara Simmons, had probably the worst childhood you could imagine. Parents addicted to drugs. She experienced sexual abuse as a child. Her family life was so bad at 13, she decided, I'd rather be homeless. And she goes and starts living on the streets. At 14, she is sold into prostitution by a street gang and becomes pregnant. And then she has 20 years where she is in and out of drug use and drug abuse, and never got treatment for the many times she's been sexually assaulted. And she was in and out of prison twice. And then about 7, 8 years ago, things just clicked for her, and she decided, I'm gonna make a change. And when she got out of prison, she focused her life on trying to get a second chance. And she read my book and decided that she wanted to go to law school. And she contacted me. And I helped fill out her personal statement. And she got admitted into Seattle University Law School, where she just went on to have the most remarkable record of success of any law school student I've ever seen. She graduates in the top 5% of her class. She does all of these public internships and does all of this volunteer work, even though she's a mom and has 2 kids while she's in law school. She earns the Dean's Award for Best Law School Student. She earns the Graduate Student Award for Best Student at the entire university. And she's the first formerly incarcerated person in Seattle U grad to win a very prestigious Skadden Fellowship after law school. And when she goes to apply to the Washington State Bar Association, she has letters from 50 lawyers, 3 state court judges, and the prosecutor of King County in Seattle, all writing glowing recommendations that she should become a lawyer. And then the Washington State Bar Association denies her 6-3 and says the 6 years of good stuff doesn't outweigh the 20 years of bad stuff. She then appeals to the Washington Supreme Court. It's at that point that I get involved in the case. And I argue her case before the Washington Supreme Court. And what I say is essentially this: character is not static. People change, and the law needs to recognize that. We have a press conference on the steps of the courthouse after the oral argument. And after that, I run to the airport, and I'm flying back to DC. And it's one of these flights that has free text messaging. My wife texts and says, Tara just called and left a message and said, you won the case. I said, that's not possible. Supreme Courts do not issue same-day decisions. Call her and find out what's going on. So I get a couple text messages back, and as with many things in my life, it turns out I was wrong. 2 hours after the oral argument, the Washington State Supreme Court entered an unanimous opinion saying Tara Simmons has the character and fitness necessary to practice law. We'll write the opinion later. Tara takes the bar exam, passes. The court publishes opinion that says lawyers in the law profession have discriminated against people of color, against women, against people on the basis of their religious beliefs, of their sexual orientation, and now criminal history, and maybe we should quit doing this. I then flew out to watch Sarah get sworn into the bar. She is now a lawyer. And just a week ago, Tara Simmons is the first formally incarcerated person when elected office. She is now a state representative in the Washington State Legislature. You want to talk about a remarkable turnaround. This was a woman who, again, had the hardest childhood you could imagine and somehow overcame it. That is a lot of what the work I do on criminal justice reform is trying to give people a true second chance. And for me, that second chance turned into working for this judge and then becoming a law professor at one of the top law schools in the country, and a law school that, by the way, when I applied, said no. So I was not good enough to be a student there, but I'm good enough to teach there and become on the faculty there. And now I work on criminal justice reform, in part because it bothers me, some of the statistics I hear. The United States represents 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's prisons. We incarcerate people at a greater rate than almost every other country on the planet. It's estimated that 20 to 30 million people have felony convictions, and now 100 million Americans know someone in their close to immediate family who's been to jail or prison in their lifetime. My view is, you cannot say we are the land of liberty and freedom on the one hand, and know on the other that we're putting people in prison at a greater rate than every other place. And if putting all those people in prison actually made us safer, I would still be here arguing it's unfair and unjust. But as a legal scholar and someone who studies the system, I can tell you that putting that number of people in prison doesn't make us safer. It actually makes us less safe because of the social costs. We think when we put one person in prison, we're just punishing them. But so many of the men I served time with were fathers. And we know that when children grow up without a parent, they're at higher risk of mental health issues, higher risk of behavioral health issues, higher risk of substance abuse, and of course at higher risk of going to prison themselves. What I see is a lot of intergenerational cycles of incarceration where we lock up people, mothers and fathers, and then their kids end up committing crimes and they go to prison, and then the grandkids. And what we see are just cycles of people in and out of prison, and we never really get at the root causes of why they're committing crimes. And so now a lot of the work I do is working on that issue. I work with the White House on the First Step Act. I've worked with the Metropolitan Police Department. I've actually represented police officers in court who honestly get quite a kick out of being represented by me, given my background. And what I tell you is the criminal justice system does not fix our problems because it does not get at the root issues of why people commit crimes. And the story I always like to tell is the story of a police officer in DC told. He pulled a man over and he ran the man's record, and the man had 15 driving under suspended license convictions, meaning he had been arrested 15 times and taken to jail and charged, and sometimes had to do jail time for driving on a suspended license. And the officer asked him, "Why do you keep doing this? Do you like going to jail?" And the man broke down and started crying and said, "I can't read, therefore I can't take the driver's test." And so incarcerating that person for a 16th time was not going to stop that person from committing that crime, was not going to get at the root issue of why they committed the crime. And what I find is most victims of crime want is acknowledgement from the defendant, "Why did you do this? And what are you going to do today and tomorrow to make sure that this never happens again?" And our criminal justice system is just not set up to deal with those questions. And so one of the things I wanted to talk with all of you about today is this idea of second chances, because it's so important. If I told you something, I don't want you to take this as me being glib, but I would guarantee that if I studied most of you in your lives, that I could find that you broke federal law at some point in your life. Why do I say that? There are 5,000 federal criminal laws. There are so many criminal laws that most people break them without even knowing about it. If you sold something on eBay or Craigslist and omitted a material term, you've committed wire fraud. There's a case in the Supreme Court today. If you, a parent, get on your child's Facebook page without authorization, you may have just committed a federal felony that exposes you up to 10 years in prison. There's also a statute that says anyone who has ever used a drug on a controlled substance list and possessed a firearm is no different from being a felon in possession of a firearm. Well, you know, the entire West Coast has now legalized marijuana, but it's still illegal as a matter of federal law. So there are probably a whole lot of hunters out on the West Coast that are committing federal crimes every day and don't know about it. The reason I say that is I want you to understand that everybody has done something bad. I get it all the time. I've had federal judges, FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and I always know when it's coming. I look around. Hey, Shon, I didn't commit any bank robberies. I got caught for the things I did in my late teens and 20s. I could not be in this job today. And so I like to remind people that if everyone were judged by their worst days, their worst weeks, and their worst years, none of you would want it to follow you around for the rest of your life. But it does for people that commit felony convictions. You can be legally discriminated against in housing, employment, public benefits, voting rights, and all sorts of things. I am a white male law professor at a very prestigious university, and my felony conviction still impacts my life in so many ways. I'll tell you the way it impacts my life the most recently. When parents at my kids' school come up and say, hey, can we do a play date? Can I send my kids over to your house? I get really nervous because do they know about my background or not? And the last thing I want is them to send their kids over to my house and then Google my name and find out a lot more information that they were probably looking for. And so, you know, I worry about it all the time. We have millions of Americans who have felony convictions who are seeking a second chance at life. And I spend a lot of my time talking to businesses about second chance hiring. I know all of you have businesses, and so I would just encourage you. You will find that people coming out of prison will be some of your most loyal employees if you hire them. They will be very loyal and grateful for the second chance in the same way I was when Copple Penny decided to take a chance on me. And so, you know, my job is to make sure that everybody gets a second chance. And as society, we should want that, because when people get out of prison and they feel like they have a true second chance at life, they tend to do the right things. When people think that they're going to be locked into a job paying $8 an hour and they have no chance of upward mobility, or they can't find work at all, that's usually when people revert back to crime. And as I like to remind people, if we were all put to the choice between homelessness or crime, I think most people would rationally choose crime, because no one chooses to be homeless, or at least not many people. And so most of the people I saw in prison, they weren't evil people. They were just people that made bad choices, but most of them had the power to be redeemed. They just needed a little bit of help. Or they were like me, and they just needed to grow out of some of the foolishness. It will not surprise any of you that the primary producers of crime in this country are young men 18 to 25. It will also not surprise anyone who is female in this audience that all of the social science tells us young men's brains mature slower than women's do, and that young men have all sorts of problems with things like impulse control and thinking about a goal that's far off in the future. That was certainly the case with me, and that was certainly the case with a lot of young men I saw in prison. It's also the case that we tend to use the criminal justice system to fix all of our failings. And what I saw in the prison systems were, especially in states that had cut back on mental health facilities, those tend to be the states that ended up having to build more prisons. Many of the people I served time that had mental health issues, if they had just gotten treatment, they would not have committed crimes to begin with and victimized people. And so I spend a lot of my time trying to talk about second chances. And for those of you that are in the business of hiring people, I would encourage you to look at people and evaluate them holistically and recognize that just because they made a mistake, that is not necessarily something about their character. We all change from our 20s to our 40s. Why do we think people in prison can? I certainly. With that, I will quit talking and answer any sort of questions that you want. Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening to my story. And thank you for inviting me here today. And I take on all questions. So talking to you.
You mentioned your wife and your two children. I don't know if I phrase this right. How did she give you the second chance?
This is my favorite story to tell. My wife and I grew up in the same hometown, a sprawling metropolis of 2,500 people in rural Nebraska. We knew each other, but not well. She was a year younger than me. She was at the Catholic high school. I was at the public high school. She actually dated a friend of mine. And I would never in a million years have believed that she would have had any interest in me. She was the prettiest girl in town. I'm not. She was the smartest, most successful girl in town. I was not. And so I was very surprised when I got a postcard from her. Her dad became is a very successful entrepreneur. He was a veterinarian and started a mail order business out of his garage that turned into a $10 million 100-employee business. My mom worked for Annie's dad, and Annie, when she finished college, worked for her dad and became friends with my mom. And one day she asked my mom, "Hey Becky, what's Shon up to?" And my mom said, "Oh Annie, where have you been? Shon's in federal prison for robbing banks." I think most people in Annie's circumstances would have been like, okay. But for whatever reason, she told my mom, "Hey, I'm going to write him." And I remember my mom telling me, "Hey, do you remember Anne Marie Messner?" I said, "Of course I do. She's going to write you a postcard." And I said, "Oh, that's nice, Mom. But I bet Annie has more important things to do than write me." And I was shocked when I got this card. And it turned into, I sent her a letter back. She was going through some struggles at the same time I was. She struggled with anorexia for about 20 years. Twice she was down to 63 pounds and on the brink of death. And so when she starts writing me, she is in inpatient treatment for anorexia, and I'm in federal prison. And needless to say, struggle tends to bring people together. And it was through 300 letters and phone calls and the occasional visit that we became really close. She came to visit me for the first time the day after Thanksgiving in 2001. I grew up in Nebraska. I am a diehard Nebraska Cornhusker fan. My Cornhuskers were playing the Colorado Buffaloes that day for a chance at the national championship. And they called me for a visit in the middle of the game. And my wife will tell you, this is the only time I have walked out on a Husker game in my life. So I went up to the visiting room and I was a little nervous because, I had not seen Annie in 8 years. And I thought, how should I approach her? And then I thought, well, good grief, Shon, you're in prison. What's the worst that can happen? So I walked up to her and gave her a kiss on the lips. And she didn't smack me, even though she was also wearing a very large diamond engagement ring on her finger. We had talked for 8 hours. She came back the next day and was no longer wearing the wedding ring. She had been on and off with this guy for 4 years and just needed a little push to end that, and happened to end it. And we weren't like boyfriend, girlfriend, but we just became really close friends through those letters and phone calls and visits. And so my dad passed away at the age of 50 from cancer about a year before I was released from prison. And Annie came to visit me. And I kind of knew after that visit that when I got out, that was it for me. And so, she drove me around to all those job interviews. I ended up moving in with her 3 weeks after I had done nearly 11 years of custody with the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I tricked her to go to Whole Foods and managed to propose to her at Whole Foods and completely surprised her. And to my surprise, she said yes. We had a son quickly after that, and now she has gone to law school at Catholic University and is now a lawyer, and we work together on cases. She saw something in me when nobody else did, and you have to understand that when she said yes, I was working at Cockle making $12 an hour, had multiple felony convictions, had $175,000 in restitution, and the idea that I would go to law school was a pipe dream. And so, I like to tell people I divide my life into pre-Annie and post-Annie, and let's just say post-Annie has been a little more successful for me than pre-Annie. For those of you that don't know, marriage is actually one of the great ways that men get together and age out of crime. It's been shown to reduce recidivism. So, you know, when men get married and have kids, they tend to put some of their foolish ways behind them, the social science tests. Next question.
So what's the chances that the Republicans are gonna win the Supreme Court with all their battles? Their stories of battles.
Well, I don't know. Election law is not my area of expertise, but it does not look promising for them at the moment. They're getting rejected by judges all over the country. In fact, there was a Republican appointee, George W. appointee in Philly, just a couple days ago that was very unhappy with the lawyers' arguments and started yelling at them that they didn't have any proof of fraud. So I don't know, but right now it's not looking like the president's legal efforts are going to bear any fruit.
One of the issues I run into with job applications is they don't fill out they leave the criminal record blank. And they look like a good prospect, and then you do a check on them, you run a check on them, and they have a record, and we toss them out. But we've had employees that have filled it out and hired them, and they've been good employees. But
Maybe,
how do you suggest you handle it?
yeah, maybe you should put something on there. I tell you, the hesitancy is, people think that if they put that on the initial application, they won't get an interview. And most people, like myself, I agree, this was certainly the case for me with the office. I would much rather be able to stand in front of the potential employer and tell my story face to face than just have it written down on paper. And so I think many people think that they should not put that on there until the interview. That's one of the things that second chance hiring, there has been a movement called ban the box, to ban the box that says whether or not you have a felony conviction. I don't know whether that's successful or not, because again, if it just gets someone to the interview stage and then they say there's criminal history and then they don't get the job, it's not actually doing what we think it is. And I just believe that employers should have that information. I'm much more of that we don't need a law, we just need to encourage businesses to hire people knowing that they have a criminal record. So maybe putting something on the application form that says, if you check this box and explain your criminal history, that does not preclude you from getting an interview, might go a long ways towards assuaging any fears they have of telling that up front.
So was there 5 key points that you would recommend that we would consider to help be a part of the solution to giving a second chance?
Yeah, just view people holistically, I think is one of the things. I mean, so many people, their criminal histories relate to things they did in their teens and 20s. And if you see they've gone 10, 15, 20 years without having any issues, I don't think you should hold that against them. Needless to say, I think most people in their teens and 20s broke the law. I certainly did. For a lot of things I didn't get caught for, and most people I know did as well. And I don't think that's a judgment on someone's character, particularly once they hit 30 and 40 and grow out of some of those things. So I would encourage you to just not reject someone out of hand, interview them. It may not be a right fit for you. It may not be a right fit for the type of work that you would have them do, but you would be surprised how many of those people have all sorts of things that they can bring to the table. And again, loyalty to whoever gives them a second chance is probably at the top. They also tend to be hard workers because they're very grateful. They're just grateful for people to give them a second chance. And so, you know, I gave the same talk to the Restaurant Association last year. And many of them came up to me and said that some of their best employees were people that they hired who had come directly out of prison, let alone have criminal histories. So, you know, I think if we were all gave more second chances, turns out this is also good policy too, right? Because when people think they're going to get a true second chance, they tend to try and rehabilitate themselves while in prison, and they tend to do the right things when they get out. It's usually when people feel hopeless that they revert back to crime.
What types of cases are you taking right now?
Oh, I have all sorts of fun cases. I get all sorts of interesting cases. You know, I've got an oral argument in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals next Tuesday, which is the Federal Court of Appeals for Florida, Georgia, and Mississippi. And in that case, it's about something related to the First Step Act, which Step Act was a bill that was passed by Congress in December of 2018. I worked a lot on that bill. I was fortunate to be in the Oval Office the day the president signed it. And one of the things that it changed was it allows now judges to look at someone's sentence 10 or 15 years down the road and determine whether that person was sentenced too long and whether they have a good record of rehabilitation. And we want judges to do that. I mean, one of the things my judge said about me, Judge Richard G. Cup, said that when Shon stood up at sentencing and said, I'm going to change my life, you won't see me again. Judge Cup said, I would have bet all the farm and all the animals that Shon wouldn't have never made a productive citizen and that he would continue with a life of crime. And what Shon has shown me, and these are his words, not mine, is that my sentencing instincts suck. And what I told Judge Cup, it's not your sentencing instincts that suck. We ask too much of you to figure out at the front end when someone's committed a crime and being sentenced, who has the power to go to prison and turn it around and who doesn't. That's why we need second looks for people to go back and reevaluate. And that was certainly the case for me. I'm now good friends with Richard G. Cup. Last August, we went to his courtroom where he sentenced me, and he took pictures of me and my wife and 2 kids, and my 8-year-old daughter Grace ran off with his gavel. So, you know, I have lots of moments where I just feel like, you know, is this a dream? Am I really alive? And a lot of times where it just feels very surreal. One of the cases I worked on, and you may have seen him on TV, is a man named Matthew Charles. Matthew was sentenced to 35 years for a nonviolent drug offense. He did 21 straight years in the Federal Bureau of Prisons without receiving a single disciplinary report. You know, I'm often held up as the model of rehabilitation. I got 2 incident reports in 10 years. And that's only because I was caught twice for some of those things I did in those early years when I'm still in my young and foolish stage. Matthew went 21 years without anything. He files for a motion for resentencing. The judge resentences him. He goes back to his community in Nashville and does everything we want of people coming out of prison. He gets a job. He gets mixed community at his church. He gets a stable place to live. Every Saturday, even though the first 2 years out of prison are very difficult for anyone, every Saturday, Matthew went down and volunteered at a soup kitchen for the homeless called, can't make this up, the Little Pantry That Could. Matthew volunteers his time every Saturday at that soup kitchen. And the Department of Justice appealed his sentence and won in the Court of Appeals. And the judge had to bring him back into court and resentence him to 9 years after Matthew had been out for 2 years. And after Matthew had made all of these things to get on with his life and had shown that he was not a danger to the public, Matthew had to go back into prison for 9 years. I started representing him, trying to get the president to grant him clemency. And Matthew turned out to be the first person who was released from prison under the First Step Act. And I had a camera crew with Lester Holt and NBC Nightly News standing outside the jail when Matthew came out. And a week later, Matthew is sitting on my couch playing with my kids. And a couple days after that, Matthew is the guest of the president at the State of the Union address. And the president had Matthew stand up and said, "Welcome home, Matthew." Needless to say, I get to work on some pretty cool cases, and that's just an example of one where people have gotten a second chance. I won a case just in August for a man who received 213 years. He was from Pennsylvania. He committed 9 robberies of massage parlors in and around Philadelphia when he was 22. The reason he got a 213-year sentence is because he exercised his constitutional right to a jury trial, and the prosecution stacked charges on him that basically buried him and gave him a life sentence. I think most people, like Adam Clausen, 22 years old with a life sentence, would have just gave up. He then went on to compile one of the best records of rehabilitation I've ever seen in someone in federal prison. We applied for compassionate release in August. The judge said yes. We had a hearing on how far to reduce the sentence. The judge ultimately reduced it by 189 years to time served, and Adam Clausen walked out of federal prison. He has now been living in Las Vegas for the last 2 months, working at a place called Hope for Prisoners, which has mentors from the Las Vegas Police Department who mentor people who are coming out of prison. He's contributing to society. I have no doubt he will be one of the best contributors to the public good of anyone I know. And again, another person very deserving of a second chance. We need to give more people second chances for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which, someday somebody in this room may make a mistake, and you're going to want a second chance too. And so I encourage all of you to the extent you can to follow my message of second chances, because I think it's important that we do so as a society.
Do you have any aspirations to run for public office? If you did, with your felony convictions, that keep you from doing it legally, or would you be allowed to run for public office?
No, I am allowed to run for public office, but after having worked with Congress and the White House for several years, I would never even think of doing such a thing. I spent a lot of time in Senate office buildings in 2018, and, some of the things I heard were disturbing, which is, so many times right answers don't matter up there. What matters is Republican or Democrat. And that was hard for me to hear when people would say, Sean, I know you have the right answer. That might actually make society better, but politically that's not feasible. And so I much prefer litigation over policy reform. At least with litigation, I've convinced myself and lied to myself that I have some semblance of control over the outcome. With members of Congress, not so much. Sometimes it feels like dealing with my kids. Only they will actually listen every now and then.
You have some questions online.
Yeah, we have some online questions. So the first is from Dusty. He says, I work for the Trade Institute of Pittsburgh, and we train guys who just get out of prison at trade and help get them a job. What advice or tools do you have for our students who are trying to better their lives?
Oh, well, first, just thank you for doing that. Thank you. What I tell you is almost every successful reentry story I've ever seen involved community. We are such social beings. And when people get out and they feel they are given a true second chance and they are welcome despite their background, they tend to flourish. When they feel that they're not given a second chance, that they're going to be judged every day for the one bad thing they did, they tend to not do so well. And so, creating a community where people feel welcome is so important. One of the things I talk to with policymakers all the time is this idea that you want people in prison to have constant communication with the outside world. People that are in contact with friends and family tend to behave better in prison, but they also tend to do better when they get out of prison. And the reason's pretty easy to understand. If you get out and you're living on the knife's edge, paycheck to paycheck, and something happens with your job, and you don't have any family or friends or community to fall back on, that's when people are put to the choice of homelessness or crime, and that's usually when people revert back to committing crimes. We don't want people to get to that point. And so, for me, my community were the Cockles and that little family-run business that welcomed me and knew about my past and didn't hold against me, and then law school. And I have seen other people get that sense of community, whether it's a church, a synagogue, a nonprofit, from work, a school, junior college. But when people feel community, it's a deterrent to committing crime, but it's also an incentive for them to do the right thing. So the more that they feel welcome, the more success they will have.
And we've got one more. This is from Trisha. She asks, how would you reform federal sentencing? Maybe in 3 steps.
How would I reform federal sentencing? I would not send as many people to prison that we do now. And for those people that we do need to incapacitate, and there are people that are dangerous and need to be incapacitated to protect society, we don't need to do it as long as we do. We tend to take people and put them in prison for 10, 20, and 30 years when it's not necessary. All of the social science data tells us people tend to age out of crime. So putting people in prison for their 50s and 60s makes very little sense. And so I would reform our sentencing practices to look like most of the rest of the world. Most of the rest of the world does not send people to prison for the things that we do. And when they do send people to prison, it's not about punishment. It's about rehabilitation. 95% of the people we send to prison are coming out someday to be in our communities and be our neighbors. I think that should be incumbent upon our correctional system to actually try to rehabilitate people. Here's the great irony of the American criminal justice system. The longer someone spends in corrections, the least likely they are to come out and live a law-abiding, successful life. And it's not hard to understand why. You take someone, you isolate them from everyone they love. You put them into an environment with a bunch of other similarly situated people who have made bad choices, and they have the ever-present threat of violence. It would be hard for anybody to be rehabilitated under those circumstances. So what I see a lot of are people that come out of prison and have trauma. I work with a lot of veterans that have gone to prison and say the trauma of prison was just as bad as the trauma from combat. And so we need to focus more on rehabilitation and less on punishment. And we have a more successful and effective criminal justice system.
I think it was Oregon recently passed the decriminalization of drugs. And I think the thought behind that is too that I think people's prison, send them somewhere where they can be rehabilitated and kind of like grow and recover from addictions and stuff like that. So I know nothing about law. How long in the making was something like that?
Yeah, well, it's been going on for quite some time. I think the biggest winner of the November election was criminal justice reform. We had a bunch of states, Oregon decriminalized all drugs, but we had a bunch of states that decriminalized marijuana. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that decriminalizing marijuana is without fault. You know, there are harms that will be caused, but most of those states have come to the conclusion that treating it as a public health issue rather than a crime and punishment issue is far more effective policy. Far more effective policy. And, you know, Colorado and Washington decriminalized marijuana. People thought the world was going to end, and it didn't. And those states, you know, again, they've had some problems with people smoking marijuana and driving, but far less problems than alcohol. Far less problems than alcohol. And so, you know, I think the country is moving towards this idea that we don't always have to be so tough, and we don't have to saddle people with felony convictions to get people to do the right things. And I think a system that's based on putting people in treatment rather than prison is going to be far more successful.
Thank you so much for your stories of hiring. Really amazing. What would be some ways that you would suggest to help a mental lawyer or someone who's just or a non-lawyer, either way? If I would like to, I'm a lawyer to choose for the lawyer. What would be some ways that I could help?
I get this question a lot. How do I help with criminal justice reform? And most people want to know, should I join an organization, give money, help pass a law? I've got something more immediate that all of you can do. Go teach a class in prison. Go teach a class in prison. You have a lot of wisdom and guidance that you could share with people there, and you will have a profound impact on the people that you teach. But you know what? It will also have a profound impact on you. I have not met a person who has gone into prison who didn't come out saying that changed how I view people in prison. We had more Americans going into the prison system that seen what I saw. You know, I grew up in a family where no one had gone to jail, let alone prison. And I can tell you what I thought. Well, prison is where the evil people are. That's the worst of the worst. And then I went to prison. It wasn't evil people. It wasn't the worst of the worst. It was just people. Some of them didn't have a lot of opportunities to begin with, but a lot of them made poor choices. But I'm telling you, most of the people I saw had the power to turn it around. Also, is the case that wardens tend to treat people in their prisons a lot better when they know volunteers are coming in and actually seeing things. You know, one of the reasons why we have such an emphasis on police reform is because we've seen things, because it's been captured on video for the last 4 or 5 years. Prisons are a black box. And there are things that go on in prison that are horrific, that are not seen because there aren't cell phones and videos. And so, you know, I want more people to go into prisons because I think you can really help the people in prison there and share your wisdom. But I also think there are other benefits that come from that. People will be treated better if wardens know more people are coming into the prisons. And so for those of you that can, I would encourage you to go in the prison system and teach a class. You can teach a class on anything. But you all have a lot to offer people in prison. You know, some of the people I serve time with just have not experienced the normal things in life. I can't tell you how many people I serve time with who never had a bank account, who never known how to balance a checkbook. And obviously, not all of these prisons are giving people the training and the knowledge they need to have success on the outside. So we need more people to go into the prison system and volunteer and share huge impact on people. Other questions?
Have you ever taken on a case for somebody that wanted a second chance, and you were like, okay, halfway through, oh man, I shouldn't have done this?
I've never had that. I've had cases where I was concerned about how they were going to act before the case was decided because they were under such strain. You know, Kara Simmons being a good example of that. She wasn't in prison, but she had been denied by the bar and sat there for 7 months while we litigated her case, not knowing if the loan she took out for 3 years of law school and 3 years of law school she had spent, whether she was actually going to get to become a lawyer. And when people are under that much stress, you know, you have to, there's a reason why they call lawyer counselors. And you have to counsel people and help them walk through it. And I've had the same experience with families where I'm representing someone who's in prison. And, you know, just getting them to focus on things they can control rather than focusing on the things they can't. But for the most part, you know, I'm lucky in that I'm not a public defender. I'm not a normal practicing lawyer, so I kind of get to pick and choose the cases I want. And I tend to pick and choose cases where, you know, I think the person is going to do very well at their release, and also cases in which the legal ruling is going to help more than just them. So these cases that I choose, if I win, like if I win this case in the 11th Circuit, it could impact 150,000 people in federal prison. And so I look for cases that are going to have a large impact. And so sometimes it's less about the person I'm representing and more about winning the larger legal issues.
Thank you, Shon.
Well, thank you very much for having me.